All right, Hakeem, let's get right down to it. I've got a question from Justin right here. Ooh, and he's getting into the thick of it with my boy Gnome. So Justin, or actually is Jusin, Jusin. Jusin asks, one argument made by Chomsky when he compares Indian and Chinese famines is that India had a more open media environment, which forced the government to intervene productively when journalists would expose malpractices resulting in starvation or other humanitarian crises. The Soviet Union, like China, did not have this. They chose not to be public about the events in Ukraine because this would have been the basis of a crisis of domestic and international legitimacy. What do you make of this argument from Chomsky, and what may it tell us about how we view the scale of these famines that occurred in both communist states? And I just want to commend Jusen. Amazing question.
That's a very interesting question.
And I can reread it if you
I
want
would
to chew on it a little bit more there.
no, that's yeah, no, that's fine. Don't worry. I think we can split that into two bits. The first part is about journalistic freedom, and then the second part is about the publicity of the famines. On the first part, I agree wholeheartedly. There is, and historically has been, an issue with, let's say, levels of journalistic observation, we could say, of these events, and that occurred both in China and the USSR, but with the necessary caveats I'll answer in the second half of this. But you're very much correct. This is something that needs to be rectified in the future. We shouldn't have there is two sides to it, right? On one hand, we understand that the press, like everything else in a modern nation state, can be used by different entities for different purposes. So, for example, if there is a possibility for a particular group to use it to spread, let's say, anti-Semitic or racist or sexist remarks and attempt to popularize them in society, these are things that can be combated. But on the other hand, free access of information, especially when it is of vital importance to people's lives and access to the things that they need, this is something of utmost importance and should be allowed to an extent. So this is very much so an error of former socialisms that needs to be corrected in future attempts. As for the second part of the question on the publicity aspect, I would disagree in that the claim there, for example, when we're taking the 1931-1932 famine, is that there was no publicity. The thing is that the central government didn't even know what was happening until maybe the mid 1931. So it's been already going on for a little bit. This happened because of numerous issues, particularly mid-level official corruption and also the fact of that there was very primitive. We got to remember that most of these countries, for example, the USSR and China, came from incredibly poor agrarian semi-feudal states, and as a result they did not have the infrastructure for communication that we kind of take for granted today. Most of the time it was either through telegrams or through people personally delivering letters, for example in China, and with that I think we can see that there's more nuance there, that it's very difficult to have this open amount of information be spread, especially when the government, who needs to know the most about the situation, could barely even get a hold of the information necessary, what's exactly going on. You even see it in telegrams that have been, what's the English word for this? Declassified, I believe. Yeah, declassified, from the Soviet archives, where you see the central government, some of the telegrams being signed directly by Stalin, saying, what is going on? We have no idea what's going on. Why don't you guys, where is this information? Why is it 2 weeks late? Blah, blah. There's several of these that you see. So it shows that the chaos of the thing. When it comes to the Chinese experience, it's similar, but it's also way more nuanced than that.
Well, can I
just
like
say,
wait in there real quick?
freedom or lack
I'm sure that
thereof.
we could find. Yeah, I'm sure that we could find
Go ahead.
innumerous telegrams from Donald Trump right now at the pinnacle of human telecommunications, where he's like, "What's going on? What the fuck is happening?" and so forth. The first part of your argument is really strong, where you say that that it took a while to understand the capacity of the depth and scope of what's going on, but they did have modern telegraphic communications at that point, or relatively modern. I don't. Well, let me not wade in too deep, but I do want to move the AMA along. I think that's a good answer.
Sure thing.
I'd like
Go
to
ahead.
get to Chimichanga's answer right here. Chimichanga's asks, why do you think the value of items is objective and not subjective when there are multiple examples to prove you otherwise? For example, the value of a coat changes depending on what season we're in. And if you're going to say price and value are different, then explain cryptocurrencies. Is there a difference between their price and their value when they directly correlate based on scarcity?
Yeah, I really like this question because the person answers it, and then when they assume that I'm going to state the answer, the correct answer to that, then they're like, "Oh, well, if you're going to say this, then what is about this?" But the second part is also answered by the first part. So first thing is, when it comes to objectivity of values, you need to understand that first of all, there's a misunderstanding that goes on between price and value, between the basic. This is the best way of actually internalizing the Marxist criticism of capitalism. Always remember that when we have discussions, for example, between value and price, remember that the assumption there is that supply and demand is equalized. That's why, and we see that when we have such in the real world, these situations rarely occur, but we can empirically create them when testing, right? And when we do that, we see that price does generally fluctuate to levels as high as 98% around the value, the labor input of said commodity, which is very interesting. But the thing about, for example, like a coat is more or less valuable depending. It doesn't matter what you personally perceive it as, right? If supply and demand were equalized, then it would be the value wouldn't change. What you're seeing is a difference in the supply and the demand happening. There's a higher supply in winter and a lower supply. Higher demand in winter and a lower demand in summer. And as a result, because of the higher demand in winter, people want it more, hence the price goes up. If there's a lower demand in summer, then less people want it, and as a result, the price goes down. As for cryptocurrency, this is very interesting. Especially when we get into the discussion of fiat currencies and whatnot. There's some interesting stuff that's been written on this. But generally, from the Marxist position, you got to realize that when it comes to cryptocurrencies, that's nothing more than your electricity bill being monetized, essentially. There is a value, there is a social and labor time for recreating, for example, a Bitcoin. Right now, that can change depending on the amount of effort that needs to go into creating it. People say, "Oh, it's just a click of a button." But when you do mining nowadays, you have to take into account, for example, all the labor that goes into everything that you need to get that to get the mining done, which includes the electricity, includes the computer components, includes the networks, all the engineers that put the system together, and what have you. And the reason that there is heightened, like let's say the prices, the seeming price is very high, is because there's speculation on these, right? People want to hoard coins so that the price goes up, so then they sell it, right? This is still a supply and demand argument. You're not getting to the core, which is value. If you want to understand value, then Marx has an excellent essay called Value, Price, and Profit. It's very short, it's very concise, and I highly recommend you take a look at it. It'll clear up all these and more. There's also another one called Wage, Labor, and Capital. These two essays, if you were to take a look at them, you're going to get, I'd say, the gist of the Marxist criticism of capitalism without having to touch capital, which I still recommend you do. It's not nearly as hard as people make it out to be.
All right, great. Let's take a deep breath. you have at least 2 hours here. Wally P. OK, TJ Silius 24/7 asks, "Why are you a commie?" And if you wouldn't mind detailing what particular flavor of communism is most appealing to you and why.
Sure, I'd love to. By the way, apologies if I speak quickly. That's just my natural rate of speech. I realize I need to slow it down sometimes.
Yeah, just a tiny bit. Yeah. You know, we're all friends here.
Yeah, my apologies. Of course, yeah, no, I'm having a great time. I love doing these AMAs because people come with they're very open with their questions. They don't hide any punches. Is that the English saying? You know what I'm trying to say.
They're right in your face, yeah.
But yeah, so why am I a communist, and what is the flavor of Marxist that I am, that I consider to, or socialist that I consider to be ideal? The reason I am a Marxist personally is because, well, I'm Iraqi, and my personal experience has been growing up in this country is that of continued imperial aggression against my country. That, and also I lived in I grew up in an environment that was of an anti-colonial flavor, let's say. And that kind of parallels a lot of third world people and their politics. But for the longest time, I was just that. I was just a lukewarm, like anti-colonial, vaguely anti-imperialist. I know I didn't like the way that the big, quote unquote, big countries bullied the small countries, and I had no fundamental understanding or framework around that. A couple of years passed, I come across the writings of Marx while I'm doing my own political research. And I decide to read Marx first, and I read Lenin afterwards. And reading Lenin's Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, really gave me that fundamental framework of what I was feeling. Why is finance capital, monopolies, this conquering of new markets? Why is it that sometimes it's insidious, like IMF loans? Why is it sometimes outright with military action? This was like the first step to seeing the light, you could say, from me. Then afterwards, I delved deep into the criticism of capitalism, because I had my own vague criticisms of capitalism that almost everybody does, right, with their political system and whatnot. I had those same criticisms that were kind of untargeted, but I took a look into that. I read the criticisms of capitalism that existed. I looked into the histories of the different socialist countries. I looked into the history of liberalism, for example, and as an ideological trend, and that kind of helped me understand why the world is the way it is, why things have historically happened, and what the future could possibly look like. It kind of gives you like this holistic approach. It isn't a dogma. It isn't something that's meant to, like peer into the future, right? It's not like this crystal ball, but it gives you the tools to carry out an empiric and material analysis of the world around you, and to arrive at answers that can somewhat at least reflect the realities of the world you live in, rather than give you, vague platitudes or sophistry about, freedom and all that kind of relatively vague talk. So that's why I'm a Marxist. I was vaguely, by my environment, and I decided to read, and that made me. And that's my recommendation to everybody. If you have criticisms of Marxism, or you just kind of don't know where you politically stand, approach the literature. It's a lot easier to read than people make it out to be. It's very interesting, and even if you disagree with it, which you're well within your right to, it will still kind of give you food for thought. If you disagree with 95%, hey, you'll get 5% that's kind of good that you can incorporate into your own personal perspective. It's lovely. So if you want to do the reading, do the reading.
Yeah.
As for the next part of the question,
flavor. Yeah.
Yeah. Don't worry, I remember. Thank you for keeping tabs on it, though. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. If you hear me like being like,
as-
hey, that's me moving the conversation along there. So yeah, by all means.
I do appreciate you. Thank you. My particular flavor, I'm a Marxist-Leninist, and I believe personally that Marxism-Leninism is the I don't want to use the word ideology per se, but it is the approach that has best described and understood the world as I see it, and as I've lived it. And it is the thing that gives me the tools, or historically has given many different kinds of people across the earth, many millions of people across the earth, the tools to grab, like to grab life by the hand, by the horns, let's say, to be able to change their current state, and to be able to analyze the situation the way that it is. The reason I'm not an anarchist or other variants of Marxism is a mixture of lack of historical relevance and success, to be very blunt with it.
Yeah, that's fair.
And secondly, also the approach. Yeah, and the approach of their analysis is usually very either muddled or just kind of placed or somewhat skewed in one way. And that's kind of why I choose Marxism-Leninism. But really, if you, the fundamental is, I read Lenin, and that kind of like brought everything into place. And then I read Mao, and I was like, wow, okay, yeah, this is really, this is the box that I want to sit in. So that's my recommendation. Read Lenin, read Mao, then see if you're a Marxist-Leninist. If not, hey, all's fair.
Okay. So our next question comes to us from Ali Nali. So Ali Nali says, I've heard Marx describe democratic socialists or revisionists as dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Can you elaborate more on how that looks in our current day and age?
Sure. I would like to see where this person saw Marx commenting this, because the concept of democratic socialist didn't exist back then.
Yeah, like I think he's a little bit incorrectly paraphrasing, but the phrase "dictatorship of the bourgeoisie."
I understand.
From what I understand. So, I think what he's asking here is to draw a parallel from his idea of a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie to perhaps how the party has been co-opted by wealthy status seekers now, or how you feel about it.
For sure, yeah, yeah. I just want to. I was just saying that just to give clarity. For people who
Absolutely.
aren't who are unaware of Marx's works, Marx, I believe, never really used the term revisionist, nor had he used the term democratic socialist. But if you're meaning generally like those that would be considered to serve the interests of a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. First of all, let's define our terms. What is the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie? So when we have a state, right, the concept of a state, it is a class-dominated thing. It is not class-neutral, right? There is a certain class character to each state that exists in the world. And when we define if it's a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie or dictatorship of the proletariat, it doesn't particularly mean it is a literal dictatorship in the like Roman sense, right? What it means is that only that class's interests are, let's say, pushed forth or advocated for by the state, because the state directly serves those interests. The United States, for example, is a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. How is this empirically proven? How can we see this? Well, it's not too difficult to take a look at. It's not an idea of, there is a co-opting of the democratic, of almost like a class-neutral democratic system to the interests of the wealthy. No, the system is simply built from its very first brick to support the interest of the ruling class, of the bourgeoisie, of those that own the means of production, own capital, right? How can this be like evidenced? Well, number one, lobbying that exists in the United States. When we take a look at lobbying, or basically it's bribing by another term, really, what it is it's pushing minority, quote unquote, minority interests, meaning minority as in like industry interests, meaning like large business interests. It never means like, for example, hey, let's try to get more African American women into universities. That's not the sort of minority interest we're talking about. These sort of modalities, let's say, for influencing state policy exist. Not only this, excuse me, it is very late here and I've been talking all day because I just got off work, so my voice may sound a little weak now. Yeah. But not only this, but we also have something that's, I think everybody's experienced in their life, particularly in the United States, for example, is that look around you, look around your community, look around the things that need to be done. What is the stuff that almost everybody that you talk to generally wants to have, at least to some extent? Some level of education that's free and of high quality and provided by the state, or not even provided by the state, but at least accessible education. Some level of healthcare, whether you want it to be single payer or universal, whatever, some level of healthcare that's accessible to the majority of the population, some level of state subsidization for example, life-saving medicines. So people in the United States don't need to go and pay $600 per insulin dose, for example. The infrastructure of the United States to help you get to and from work and school and to your grocery store and stuff like that. People would like to see that improved. People would like to see increased opportunities for their children for example, employment. So they don't have to like slave away in like intern jobs and be paid nothing only to get maybe a whiff of employment. You know, all these sort of things. When you look at the United States as it is, for example, right now, you see that all of these things that would serve the interests of the proletariat, of the working class, of the vast majority of people are not catered to, right? But what do we see like in real policy? We see things that advance the interests of the military-industrial complex. We see things that advance the interests of pharmaceutical companies. We see hike-ups on prices on things that everyday people need, while also we see tax cuts for the richest. Even if on occasion some, like a Democrat comes into power and there's some level of a, slightly increased tax on the wealthy, it is so superficial and so easy to get out of that it practically is null. Why is it that in a supposedly, quote unquote, class neutral democratic system, the interests of the vast majority of people are completely ignored, while the interests of a small minority, that number in the thousands, really, like 3, 5, 10,000 people maybe, right? Why is it that their interests are catered to? That's because the system is not class neutral, and that's because we live in a so-called dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Now, as to the solution, many people have different ideas. Social Democrats think that there should be just more state oversight and more like a nationalization of some certain industries. Marxist-Leninists, or Marxists of all flavors, think that there should be an abolition of capitalism. Marxists believe that we should conquer state power. Anarchists think that we should just do away with the state altogether. The solution and the potential future is up to you to decide based on your own reading. But what I want to impart on to you is that the current system we live in isn't as class neutral as some people say it is, and that's what Marxists mean when they say dictatorship to bourgeoisie. I hope that's a clear answer as to what that means.
It's a very lengthy answer to the question right there. I don't think anybody who's educated in the United States thinks of it as a classless society. I think there's a little bit of a straw man argument there. But
No, I don't mean it. I don't mean it in that way. I mean, I never said classless. I mean that the democratic system in the U.S.
we
is
said
class
class
neutral,
neutral,
meaning
right? Right, like class
yeah, yeah,
neutral and
meaning it
classless. How
doesn't
do
serve.
you see these as being different from each other?
No, classless means no classes exist, meaning there's no working class, no bourgeoisie. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that class neutral means it doesn't serve any class in society. Despite there being classes in society, it doesn't serve either or. You know, it's neutral. Whoever, it's one person, one vote. You know, that's the kind of idea that I'm trying to impart. And my point being is that it is somewhat flawed, because in reality, it's not one person, one vote. It's $1, one vote, and the people who have the most dollars end up with the most votes.
Okay. Yeah. Again, even from that standpoint, I think it's like a little bit reductive. But I do want to
Fair
get
enough.
to and I want to apologize for a little bit stepping on you earlier in the thing. I'm having kind of a little bit of trouble just keeping up with the pace of conversation. You said you've been talking all day, but it did not slow you in the slightest. All right. So Sniper King says, do you think the actions the Chinese government took during the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests were justified or correct? And I'd like to know, just in general, your feelings on the current state of China and how you feel it reflects what's going on with Marxism worldwide.
Yeah, for sure. This is a very, very large question.
Mhm.
So I'm going to try to very briefly, because there's a lot that would be need to, there's 3 sections of this question that would need to be covered. So I'm going to try to do it. Yeah. And the first thing is the question of the Tiananmen Square and what occurred, and if I think it's justified. It depends on what you mean by justified, because if we're talking about how the event is covered, or is currently understood, the popular understanding of the event in Western spaces, and the events that actually transcribed, that actually went on, then there's some, let's say, disparities between those 2 views. If you want to take a deep look into it, then there's a really good reading list that is compiled by the Chiao Collective. I believe that's how it's pronounced, but it's spelled QIAO Collective, and they have a long reading list on the Tiananmen Square, exactly what happened. They use, I think, almost entirely Western sources, so you can take a look at that and see for yourself. But generally, if they were justified, the what's it called? Oh my lord! See, my English fails me sometimes. Sequence of events, that's the term that I was looking for. The sequence of events was as such. There was an occupation by mostly students within the square. They weren't advocating for free, like just some vague aspect of freedom that, as it was painted as. It was an incredibly diverse movement. There are some that were, for example, Maoists and wanted to return to more Mao-like policies. There were some who wanted the Dengist opening up and reforms to go even further than they had. There's some that wanted outright transition to capitalism. There's some that wanted more of a liberal democratic system, but still with a attempted socialist economic policy. It was a very complex movement, number one. Number two, we should not overstate the size of the movement. We got to remember that China's a country of a population of over 1 billion people. I think at the time it was 1.1 billion people. And this movement was no larger than, 70,000 people that were present there. So it really isn't representative of the Chinese people. It is better to say it's more representative of a certain layer of the intelligentsia within Chinese society, particularly within the universities. And that is evident in their demands, which included mostly things that only catered to the intelligentsia, which included political power for intelligentsia, increased pay for those who are part of the intelligentsia, certain access things within universities and whatnot. It was a very this is the aspect that was really highlighted by Western media as almost like the only part of the movement. That's the part I'm talking about. But yeah, they occupied the square, and they were asked to leave, and they held their place. And the people on the square were peaceful. What occurred outside the square, around the square, though, was certain levels of violence. If people are unaware, before any troops were mobilized, before any shots were fired, numerous Chinese soldiers that were just, if you don't know, by the way, in case you're unaware, because in the United States, I don't know if it's the same, but in most third world countries, and China is included in this, it's very normal to see a uniformed soldier on the street. In fact, it's very normal to see them just going out and about.
Previously, it
Or
used
they
to
might
be
be
more
in charge of a
common.
particular place,
Yeah,
like they just
in
keep
the
an eye
United
on a person.
States, if you're essentially if you're in proximity to a military base, you'll see in uniform or military personnel fairly frequently, but it's nowhere near the level of that you would see in a place like Mexico or Honduras, where some are there for security presence. And I think in China at the time, we would see a lot more who were just there in uniform to lend security more so than just going on their day-to-day operations.
For sure. Exactly. Thank you for much more eloquently being much more eloquent with what I was trying to say. But yeah, exactly that. And what happened outside the square before any bullets were even fired or any violence took place was severe violence against those soldiers that were present. Most of them were unarmed, by the way. Several were burned alive, even. And this was reported on, by Western media. And that's when the events transcribed. On the square itself, no massacre took place. What happened around the square, though, that's where the violence took place. It's maybe a pedantic point, but that's why I don't like the term, for example, Tiananmen Square massacre. It's a bit incorrect. And by the way, the Western media sources, if you go back and look at the BBC reporting and whatnot, you'll see. In fact, there's even the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. There was a WikiLeaks documents that show that they even admit that there was no American officials which were in the at the square and also reported to the embassy in Beijing, the American embassy, that there was no massacre that took place on the square itself. But yeah. So to say if it was justified or not, let me invert the question. Because by the way, if you didn't know, the movement, which is very well documented, all the student leaders and all the leaders of it, completely, the ones that were highlighted by the US, by the way, all of them got direct diplomatic and monetary financial support from the United States and associated groups that the United States supported. And you can see that by the fact that all of the people who were in charge of the movement, a few of them were imprisoned for several years and let go, like 2-3 years sentences and then let go. After which they immigrated to the US, or they just directly immigrated after the protest ended to the US, and all of them are in highly lucrative financial sectors. All of them live their lives in the US right now. What I'm trying to get at is that is a very interesting point, and I'd like to turn that back to the audience. Imagine if in the United States there were like protests that occurred, massive protests that occurred, which were directly supported by Chinese money, that had people that were directly in contact with Chinese officials, that when the movement then fails, by the way, after they assault numerous officials and personnel, burning some alive even, and then afterwards they leave to China, where they end up being in very lucrative positions, wouldn't you assume, maybe China had some part in this movement? And by the way, I don't mean the entire Tiananmen Square movement. There are certain sectors of that movement that did have genuine grievances. That's not what I'm trying. I'm not trying to claim that China is perfect. It never was and never is. Even currently, it isn't. But the point I'm trying to get at is the American perception or the Western media perspective on the Tiananmen Square movement, and the small sector of it that they decided to highlight is suspect. But there are other issues that were protests at the time. For example, the dismantling of the Iron Rice Bowl was something that was discussed, especially by the Mao sectors of the movement that existed in the square at the time. That is a very fair criticism to be made. There are some criticisms that are made of corruption, particularly within universities, but also of the government. Those are also fair criticisms to be made. But what I find interesting is that the United States and like official support never highlighted those grievances that directly affected people's livelihoods, employment, access to education where they are. Instead, decided to highlight very vague platitudes of democracy, freedom. Yeah, that's kind of my hope of that. My hope is that you understand my perspective. If you really are interested in this, by the way, I strongly I strongly suggest people do the reading if they're interested to see like what my perspective personally would be in more detail. Check out that Chow Collective, QIAU Collective reading list. You'll find it on Google if you look it up. As for the other questions on China, I think there in the AMA there are further questions on China.
Yeah,
China later.
we'll get a little bit later there. I think that was a pretty extensive answer to the question there. Let's move up to and just to be fair there, like a lot of the criticisms there, like similar, like and not to get into an argument or whatever, but they're just about any large protest movement, whether it's happening in Hong Kong, whether it's happening in Russia, whether it's happening in the United States, will have foreign backers and agitators attached to it. It's just too profitable not to do. So
Yeah.
it's not unique to the situation. I think that your claims are most likely accurate, and the CIA was probably involved. But just about every place where power is shifting, foreign agitators will be in there trying to get a piece of the pie.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so let's go to Chief Potleaf, who says, you have read Settlers before and other books similar to this topic, but I have never seen you talk specifically about Native American or Amerindian / Canadian issues. So I want to ask what your opinions are on decolonization in North America generally, and what Marxists should do regarding that. Also, if you could say something about specific events or movements, like the Wet'suwet'en pipeline blockade, the Dakota Access Pipeline, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, etc. That would be amazing, but I don't expect you to know about these.
Yes, thank you. The first, just on the first point that I have read Settlers. I have read Settlers. It's an absolutely excellent work. Of course, you should read it with a critical eye, but I would say it's maybe like 80% correct, 20% a bit iffy on its political conclusions. But I recommend everybody, particularly Americans, particularly those who are non-white Americans, but even those who are white, should read Settlers. It's an absolutely excellent work. As for the question of indigenous issues within the US and whatnot, you're correct that I haven't spoken about this extensively because I simply lack the knowledge. I'm sad to say, and this is actually a failure on my part, and I do apologize for this. I have not done the necessary reading on the topic, and I hope to eventually, but I currently, as of now, I have not. Not only this, but I have little to no contact of people of indigenous origin or sources of information about them. So that's a failure on my part, but also I feel not qualified to talk about such issues. And I would very much like if there was a person who is indigenous from the US or just Latin America or Canada who would like to talk about these issues. And if you would, by the way, and you'd start a channel and whatnot, then please just hit me up in the DMs. We can talk and I'll gladly boost your channel because this is something that does need to be covered.
Yeah, we would absolutely do an AMA for it. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Please continue.
Sure. As for the question itself and my perspective, I think that one of the, if not the greatest tragedy of humanity thus far has been the immiseration and absolute complete destruction, decimation of the Native American identity, Native American indigenous. I don't even like the term Native American because, yeah, you're ascribing already a colonial name onto them. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, indigenous people.
Most Amerindians do not prefer Native American. It's a confabulation.
Precisely. So I would say it's one of the greatest tragedies, if not the greatest tragedy of humanity, what has been done to them and how they have, to this day, not been able to achieve even a level of dignity from what they've had. For example, you look at the statistics, the unemployment and poverty and alcoholism rates amongst them are some of the highest in North America, particularly in the US, but even in Canada. The disgusting level of racial propaganda, like almost like eugenic policies that were they were targeted with throughout their history, but even up to this day, with, for example, sterilization of indigenous women in prisons, for example, it is like it is beyond angering to even know about it. As to what Marxists should do, this is a group of people that we have to learn from. We have to boost their messages, and we have to personally internalize their assessment of the American question, meaning what to do with the United States. Suppose revolution were to happen, which we should be working towards, how the United States and Canada and all these post-colonial places, I mean, like after the revolution, they become post-colonial. what to do with them. How do we divide the nations up? Do we have to do a reintroduction of Native American languages and have them be like reinvigorated, spoken, and reused widely in society? Is there an issue with, let's say, educational access and whatnot, which there definitely is, but how we'd go about that? All these issues, I'm not qualified to speak on. Native American comrades are. So those are the people we should talk to, and those are the people that should have their voices heard. And as for Marxist organizations, they should internalize their critiques and their suggestions, so that hopefully in the future, what has been done cannot be undone, but at least maybe some amends can be made, and their future history can be more bright. And that's kind of my loose answer about it. I'm sorry if it's a bit unclear.
No, that's fair. And just to anybody watching or listening right now, if you are an expert in Amerindian studies or want to talk on here, we'd be happy to host an AMA with you. I will be in Window Rock doing research on the Navajo in early 2022. So I'm happy to meet up with anybody out there who wants to do a live interview on this thing. Okay, and Text Defunks here, this may not be a fair question, but I'm going to read it anyway because I've read all the other questions so far. So Text Defunks says, in your opinion, are labor camps a justifiable form of punishment in any case? And the reason why I feel that this question is not super unfair or is not totally fair at this point is at present, every prison in the United States of America is more or less a labor camp at this point. So, not to get too deep into it, but if you feel this is an interesting question, we can proceed. If not, I'm happy to move to the next.
Sure, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
The question is, are labor camps a justifiable form of punishment? And just in the U.S., that's the only form of punishment that we really use.
Yeah, for sure. So the question of labor camps. So historically, they have been used, and to this day, like you said, they are still used. For example, in the United States, with the 13th Amendment and whatnot. So it is a thing that is done. Now, as to the question of its effectiveness, effectivity. My God, my English is failing me. Excuse me.
Efficacy. Yeah, try efficacy.
Efficacy is a superior. Thank you so much. Yeah. Well, in my personal perspective, there's two views. Number one, I would like to see extensive research into this and empirical data on this to see if it is a good method of rehabilitation. If it is, then it should be continued to be. Then it should still remain, at least as a form, not as the sole form, but it should be there. As for the second side, imagine you have a place. Let's remove all the political baggage. Let's say, okay, you have a bunch of people. You have three guys, right? One of them is like a known public harasser of, let's say, women. Another guy is known for, or has been caught embezzling state funds. And a third guy has been, for example, I don't know, some other more or less illegal activity that you can imagine. I don't know, let's say dealing drugs.
Smokes dope, yeah.
Right. Exactly, dealing drugs, and I don't mean just like as a low person who's who's in poverty and has to use this as a, let's say it's like a middle level guy in a sort of organization that deals drugs. Maybe he's the guy who procures, and he has like a great investment in this endeavor. Let's say. So you have these three guys. Let's say you catch them all and you want to put them in prison. Now you have two options. Either you can leave them in prison and let them basically eat up from the social surplus. Let's say in the United States it would be taxes, for example, tax money. Mm-hmm. They'd sit, they eat, they live their life, but they don't contribute anything back to society, and they're not really being rehabilitated. They're just living their life, but in prison. So their freedoms are restricted. That's one option. What about you have another option where these people are put to work? Not only are they put to work, but after work, they have to attend classes directly related to their particular crime. They get a proper ideological education. They try to weed out whatever antisocial elements they may have. For example, the person who deals drugs would have access to people whose lives have been destroyed by drugs, who they would be able to talk to them, see the actual negative impact they have. The person who's embezzling state funds, maybe could see what that money would have gone for, and what, you get what I'm trying to see. Maybe
you're describing the way that prison currently exists here. I'm not qualified to speak on Iraqi prisons, but those are all things that we do right now in America.
Yeah, but also you
can't go to prison as a drug dealer and not see like people who are fucking literally smoking like paper that's been doused in Raid.
That's true. But what I mean is I think, a miscommunication in terms. What I mean is ideological re-education. It isn't just like, hey, come take a look at this person. I'm talking about actual classes that are relatively stringent upon this. It is practically like courses that they'd have to do. Not only this, but this is coupled with the labor. So it is more, let's say, maybe some people would dislike this perspective. Hey, if you want to disagree with this, that's perfectly fine. And I would be more than happy to hear what your proposals would be so that I could correct my view if your view that you believe is superior, if maybe you can turn me onto your side. But yeah, my general point is you can either have them just sitting and rotting, or you can have them put to work. In the United States, what happens is they are put to work and they do get some level of education, but level of education is not nearly adequate. There is massive levels of inequality when it comes to, first of all, exposure to it, attendance of it, as well as like racial and these more unpleasant aspects. Like
It varies significantly prison to prison, and just because so many of the prisons are privatized by different corporations, is really like a little bit of a crapshoot. Which prison supplying system in your area, like what subcontractor handles the education and so forth, and when you talk about cost to taxpayers, often like cost to house an inmate are upwards of like in some cases 150 juveniles. I know can be like $300 to $400 a day just to house them. So.
exactly. So that's my point. Yeah. So in the United States, the education they get is inadequate, and and they do labor, but the labor is for just cheap labor for like Silicon Valley tech bros or other like for large industries that society will never see the benefit of. Now that's in the capitalist system. In the socialist system, the ideal and historically what had been done to an extent is that they would have proper ideological education to weed out these elements that exist within this person, basically with extensive thing like multifactorial or eclectic, let's say that's a better word, eclectic approach to it, either from like medical and psychological psychiatric help to vocational training to on and on and on, as well as these people would be put to labor, but not for a small minority of very rich people to make stuff, but instead to basically to not to give profits to a small minority, but instead they could contribute to, for example, infrastructure projects of the nation. So they could give back to the country that, for example, the embezzler stole money from, for example, right, to build roads and bridges and all that kind of stuff, to build schools and hospitals. Yeah, and of course,
We did
by
that
the
in the
way,
U.S. prior to privatization. There was a lot more of that kind of chain gang labor here in the U.S. But as soon as we started privatizing, all those gains they only did forced labor that was benefiting like the parent corporation.
right. And just one more point I'd like to say. Historically, both in the United States and in former socialist countries and across the whole world, there have been grave, what is the word? Injustices committed in prisons. Funnily enough, when you look at the history, it's way greater in some countries than others. But that still doesn't excuse, for example, any sort of injustice that may happen. If somebody is being rehabilitated, that means they should still get an adequate, like have adequate housing. They should still have adequate access to nutrition and healthcare. For example, the Soviet Union early on wasn't good at this. They got much better later on. For example, if people are aware, the famous dissident Solzhenitsyn, he's the one who wrote the Gulag Archipelago. He had cancer in the Gulag when he was imprisoned, and he got treatment for his cancer to the point of remission. He was cured. I'm saying that this is something that should be, even if the people may be, if you have, for example, an embezzler or a drug addict, or whatever, that doesn't mean they shouldn't be barred from having proper healthcare and adequate access to nutrition and activities that, like, they should be able to play a game of football if they want to, and have access to even education if they want it. So let's always strive to be better and also recognize the mistakes of the past and criticize them very ruthlessly. Excuse me.
Yep.
I hope that's my point.
All right, great. Let's move on to our next question here. I'm seeing a few complaints in the chat that you are not being challenged enough on your beliefs. I'm supposed to be like a mostly impartial moderator for people like viewing in the background. I only try to call out factual disparities and add whatever small bit of personal experience I might have there. But I'm not in a debate with this is an amen. So and like it's not a free ride either. But let's go to Wardia. Yeah, CEO of.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Can I?
Please, by all means.
I would just like to say, yeah, that like you said, yeah, this is an ask me anything, so it's just a question and answers thing. If you personally have something that you'd like to challenge me on or ask me about, feel free to DM me. I will answer your DM. So please go and write up whatever you will, and I'll listen to your grievances, and I'll give my perspective, and we can have a nice discussion later.
Yeah, that's an awesome offer right there, and not one that many of our people who do AMAs are prepared to make. So please take advantage of that, everybody, because we're going through these, but he's got a lot to say, and I'm just trying to get through these questions. We'll speed up a little bit, I think. So Wardy, who is apparently the CEO of Based Takes, he says that considering 68% of the world's richest are self-made, and oh my God, that like I that does not look like an accurate statistic to me right here. But it's a CNBC article, so it's got to be true. Do you think it's moral to
Okay.
seize the means of production from them? And he cites a CNBC article from 2019. Majority of the world's richest people are self-made, says new report right there. That's not how my understanding of generational work. And let me go. The report was released by WealthX. So I'm going to do some hustling on this in the background right there. But his question, once again, is he states that 68% of the world's richest people are self-made, which I doesn't seem accurate to me, but I'm going to look into it in the background. Do you think it's moral to seize the means of production from them?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I would strongly or highly that the statistic is very suspect. I would encourage people to take a look into the methodology of how that was.
I'm linking it in the chat channel for the AMA. If anybody else wants to look into this and potentially find if it's accurate or not, there. So that's
I'm
linked in the
sure
AMA channel.
I'm sure they're doing they're lying by omission, or they're trying to they've redefined a few terms to get to this pleasant statistic. Vast majority of wealth that currently exists within the United States, especially of very wealthy people, is either generational wealth or basically gained through illicit means or less than illicit means. And most of the people who have generational wealth have got it through illicit means back in the day. So that's just generally how the trend is. So I'm that statistic seems very suspect. But let's take it at face value. Let's pretend that it's true. All right. Let's say that 2/3 of all people are self-made who become billionaires, let's say, or the mega wealthy, whatever you want to define it as. If that is the case, then let me ask you this. How do people make all that wealth? Where is the profit coming from? Jeff Bezos, let's take an example. How has he become the richest man in the world, right? He has Amazon, fine, okay. Let's say he didn't get any help from it. Let's say he did start it himself. He didn't, by the way, but let's say he didn't have any outside help. Even if at the end of the day, he did everything, like he built it himself, and then afterwards now he just stands as CEO. He currently earns what, something like tens of millions of dollars per minute or something, or per day or something, or even more than that. Some basically a staggering amount, right? Let's make it less. Let's say he earns $1,000 a minute or $1,000 an hour, let's say, which is way understating how much he gains. If that's truly the case, how much does the average Amazon worker get per hour? I believe their average, their yearly wage is like what, like $30,000. Let's make it higher. Let's make it like $50,000. Fine. Do you personally believe that, or can you qualify that Jeff Bezos works 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 times harder than the average person who works at Amazon, let's say? Let's turn the argument around. Let's say you have an engineer at Amazon. He's very smart with his work and he does everything he's supposed to do. Would you say that Jeff Bezos works also 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 times harder or smarter than that engineer? You can't make this criticism, even particularly from a moral perspective. Now, that's number one. Number two, then we actually need to look at the origins of profit. Here's where moralism goes out the window, because I don't like moral arguments. Profit, vast majority of profit comes from surplus value, meaning there's the extraction of surplus value from the labor of others. This is not a moral argument. This is a empirically proven thing. Not only this, but aside from forcible extraction of surplus value, there's also wage theft. These are two independent things that occurs. There's also illegal stuff, stuff that is considered illegal but isn't usually prosecuted. Things like 39-hour contracts, things to avoid paying benefits, things to avoid paying overtime, for example. All of these things lead to basically a buildup of wealth that is illicitly gained. That's my general point. Now, what my question is, let's say like, let's just take it at face value. Amazon exists, right? You have Jeff Bezos and a few board of directors up, and the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of workers that work underneath. Let's talk about interests of society. What would be better for Jeff Bezos to maintain his wealth and for those small board of directors to do that, or to turn that massive enterprise that, by the way, uses economic planning, in case people want it. There's no market allocation when it comes to Amazon or Walmart or any of these. There's a really good book written about that called People's Republic of Walmart, actually. So you should check that out. But this enterprise, would it be better to keep it in the hands of this small minority that just does it for their profit, or would it be better to put it in the hands of the workers themselves, so that they turn it into a cooperative that they run on a democratic basis, so that they can both ensure the quality of their own products as well as ensure the well-being of the workers that work that job, so that Amazon workers wouldn't have to pee in bottles and while they're speeding on the highway to do prime time delivery. You know, I'm trying to, it's more of a, let's say, a bombastic argument, I know, but if we want to look at really what is more beneficial for society as a whole, right, then basically what you're telling me is you really want to defend the wealth of one guy who will never do anything for you, instead of putting that massive enterprise that can do a lot of social good in the hands of the people who actually do all the work, right, and in a way could then give back to society in a way that Jeff Bezos doesn't. That's just my general perspective on that.
Okay. So in the interest of giving back to society right here, our next question comes from the audience. So I've just invited Doomshot to ask his question right here. Doomshot, are you with us? Can you hear me? I'm going to give him a second. It takes a second for people to get on the stage. Doomshot, you there? He may be muted or something like that. So I'm going to give you a few seconds to get it together and see what's happening. And if not, I may have to ask your question for you. I'm sorry. Well, you're limited on time, amigo. There you go.
Yeah, thank you for waiting for me.
No, no worries.
So my question was, in your opinion, Hakim, what do you think about these champagne socialists in the West who like look down upon the Eastern revolutionaries who try to bring about socialism by their own means, by instead of following this idealistic version of socialism which the Westerners have in the academia. They actually go on the ground and alleviate the material condition of the people. And also, what do you think about these Westerners electing Sogdem candidates in order to just fund their welfare program by using imperialistic sources?
Yeah, I got most of that question. I hope I'll do it justice. Thank you very much, Doom Shop, I believe. Yeah. All right. So the general question was, what do I think of certain sectors of the Western left and their approach to Eastern Marxists, let's say, or those in the third world, let's say, in the imperial periphery? One point that I would like to say is, let's not glamorize the third world at the expense of the work of those in the, let's quote unquote say, first world or imperial core. There are many principled and hardworking comrades that exist in the United States, in Germany, in the UK, and everywhere else. And there are also there equally exist lazy and incompetent Marxists in the third world and the imperial periphery. So let's not try to paint one well and disparage the other. With that being said, though, there do exist certain trends within the Western left, for example, that seems to just basically want more of the social democratic order that exists, for example, in Europe, instead of advocating for the abolition of capitalism and the transition to a socialist system. What I would say about these people is that it shouldn't be surprising, because they're advocating for their class interests. Now, what does this mean? What this means is that when we go into more in-depth, let's say, analysis of capitalism as it currently exists within the world, there is a certain, let's say, segment or section. Tabaqa in Arabic. The English word is not coming to mind right now. A certain segment of society that we would refer to as the labor aristocracy. These are people who are given greater, basically, concessions from the ruling class in order to placate them into a non-revolutionary or basically reactionary position against the overthrow of capitalism and the overthrow of the current imperialist system. This is not the majority of people in the West, but it is a sizable portion that you can see. these people look out for their class interests, and their class interests about abolishing capitalism isn't there, and ending the imperialist system is not there. If you want a deeper look into this, because this can be a very long question I can talk about for like the next hour, actually, I made a video on it titled "The Failure of Social Democracy," and I believe unequal exchange, I think, something like that, which you can find. It's over a year old at this point. Otherwise, I can recommend some books that you can take a look at. There is two books. There are two books that I can recommend from Zach Cope, Zakcope. The first is The Wealth of Some Nations, and the second is Unequal World, Unequal Class. Hey, no, that doesn't sound right. Sorry, my mind is blanking. But if you write unequal, I'm sure actually it is unequal world. No, divided world, divided class. Yeah, see, that's my mind was wrong. Divided world, divided class. That's one work. There is another work by Intan Suwandi, Intan Suwandi. That's called Value Chains, which I recommend. Another one is by Emmanuel Arguiri. It's called Unequal Exchange. He has another book as well titled Unequal Exchange and the Prospects of Socialism, which talks more about what you're hinting about, the labor aristocracy, what could be done with the Western left and their potential future decisions and whatnot. Yeah, other than that, I have a book recommendations video on my channel titled Book Recommendations. I believe it's number 5 or number 6, number 5. And it's titled Unequal Exchange, in which I recommend other books, for example, from Samir Amin. So I hope that will cover that question broadly.
All right, thank you to Doomshop for popping in to ask his question there. And yeah, I just like personally, I want to thank you for, I hate to see movements where they're tearing each other apart. Just based on where you're from, because it ain't about where you're from, it's where you're at. All right, let me get to the next question that we have here. Give me one sec. I have to resituate everything to get it here. So Otoya Yamaguchi 2.0 says, in your video, how rich countries rob the poor, the failure of social democracy, which I think is the one that you just referenced. So this is very timely. You claim that while Western countries get richer, poorer countries get poorer. If this is the case, how come the number of people living in extreme poverty has decreased significantly since the 1950s, and some of the fastest growing economies are the poorest? Example, South Sudan. Which like immediately, like the South Sudan case is like a very, I wouldn't cite it myself. In the same video, you imply that a decrease in the welfare state is bad for workers, when in fact inequality of wealth is higher in countries with a more developed welfare state. And he cites Fessler and Schur's 2015.
There are two errors being made in this question. I'll touch on the first. In the first one, he said that there's how come there's that poverty is decreasing. I would like you to go into the poverty statistics and take out China, and then just see how much wealth has decreased. Not wealth, excuse me. Poverty has decreased in the world. China accounts for maybe 90 to 95. I've seen some points in some studies as high as 96% of all poverty reduction in the world. Now, I don't think it's a very good, let's say, example for you to use a Communist Party-led, supposedly what it calls itself, socialist nation, as the prime reducer of poverty. Even though some people disagree with this, I'd be part of that disagreement as well. So that's number one. If you look at generally across the world, social inequality is generally increasing. Poverty, depending on how you define it, can be increasing, can be just kind of more or less the same, or has decreased ever so slightly. And that's not good enough for a time frame of like 5 decades. You know, a 1%, 2%, 5% improvement is not good enough. But that's the first point. The second point, he said, how about like the fastest growing economies, blah, blah, and then he gave...
he cited South Sudan, but it's not a fair...
I understand, but just so people understand why that is. Countries with no industrial base to begin with have really high levels of GDP growth and particularly economic development in percentage points because they are industrializing for the first time. So when you first, let's say you live in let's just hypothetically, let's say you're on an island, right? And you produce nothing on that island, right? Then your GDP will be very low. Now, all of a sudden, let's say I put a coconut processing plant on that island. You've never had one before. All of a sudden, you get to process really large amounts of coconut juice and other sorts of coconut products. All of a sudden, you're going to have massive amounts of sales, or income relative to what you used to produce, because you didn't have industrial base before. So it's going to show like a really high spike. That's when you see countries that are war-torn, for example, and then the next couple of years after the war, all of a sudden they have really high levels of economic development. That's not because all of a sudden they have an economic miracle. That's because all the former or pre-existing industrial base that existed was most likely destroyed in that war. So that's why there's the high economic growth. In South Sudan's case, there was no industrial growth before, or industrial base, before. That's why it's really high. You see this in many countries around the world. And then finally, his third thing he said, I believe, if reduction of welfare states means that the conditions of the working class are worse. And then he says countries that have higher social inequality are. Could you please just repeat the very last?
The way that he phrases it, just to get it exactly correct here, he says, in the same video, you imply that a decrease in the welfare state is bad for workers. And then he says, when in fact, inequality of wealth is higher in countries with a more developed welfare state. And he cites Fessler and Schur's 2015.
He's arguing two different points. Income inequality and well-being of the working class are two different things. You can have, for example, a system where income inequality increases, but the general trend is upwards for both. So that's one thing that can happen. Or you can have increased income inequality where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Or you can have an income inequality that is the same, but the general state of both the quote-unquote poor and the quote-unquote rich has gone down. So we're arguing two different points there. So yeah.
Let's move on to the next question by Comrade Spatial, who has messaged me. By the way, if you message me on Discord while I'm doing the AMA, I can only do so many things at once. I'll review the DMs later. But if it's like super important or something, just type it like hundreds of times in the chat. Then I'll see it. So Comrade Spatial asks, what do you think of the ECP? I know you're a fan of cockshot, but computerized central planning could not possibly take into account subjective preferences and local information, which is what the ECP critiques about central planning. He says, long live capitalism, long live the bourgeois, long live America.
Tell me that when the American brings back conscription and sends you to die in a war. My perspective personally about this is this. When it comes to the economic calculation problem, the fundamental problem isn't subjective demands. It is input outputs. That is the fundamental criticism that is being made. But let's touch on both. First of all, the claim that there is, let's say, planning cannot account for subjective demands. That is sophistry. That is actually objectively just untrue. Would you say that Walmart can adequately plan for demand, subjective demand? Would you say that Amazon can? Of course, both of them do. Well, surprise, surprise, none of them work by market mechanisms. They work based on planning, fairly extensive planning. Actually, what's very interesting is that they use similar planning models to the ones developed by Kantorovich and co. That are Soviet researchers, Soviet mathematicians that developed them. So when it comes to real life examples of meeting subjective demand, planning can take care of that. As for the economic calculation problem in general, what you have is basically an issue with, again, input output. How can you calculate for all these different products and all these different communications that exist across different time points and different locations, blah, 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 blah. Oh, the complexity is way too much. We just have to leave it to the market. Well, the market doesn't allocate to need or subjective want. The market allocates to profit. Where most money will be made, it will put resources and manpower. That's not a logical way to govern or deal with our society. That's number one. Number two, modern economic planning based on modern computing methods can more than surpass a market in decision making. Particularly, what I mean is directed decision making, not anarchy of the market sort of stuff. I'll use an analogy that I borrow from Richard Wolff, which is when he talks about markets versus planning, he criticizes markets by saying, imagine that everybody's driving on the road, right? And we have like traffic signals, but everybody ignores them because what's good for me is good for what that American capitalist said. What's good for General Motors is good for the United States. what's good for me is going to be good for all society. So everybody just drives how they will. Well, you're going to get lots of car accidents, which is exactly what happens in the markets. There's extensive anarchy and massive mismanagement and misallocation of resources, but you don't really see it because it's, number one, on a global scale, and number two, it's divided on basically who has enough money to pay for stuff, and also where the most profit can be derived. When it comes to modern computing methods, numerous studies have demonstrated the efficacy of this, of which Cockshot I like to highlight because he has very accessible information about this. There's way more, but it's very mathematical and complex, and I think you really need to be a specialist in the field to fully be able to understand it. Cockshot is the first person that I've approached that I feel can adequately explain to a layman. So that's why I recommend people check out his work Towards a New Socialism, in which he documents or describes economic planning as it couldn't possibly exist now. He also describes really interesting modes of direct democracy that could be implemented in the future. They can be implemented now, I mean, but we need a revolutionary situation for that. On and on. So the TLDR of this is that the economic calculation problem is a meme. It's been a meme for the past 50 years. It is not an issue and hasn't been since like 1956. All right, so not
100%. Yeah, absolutely. I wrote a book about this, by the way. I'm just going to plug it real quick there. It's called Hawks at the Diner by Zach ZYZ, but I literally wrote a book about this topic, and I can confirm 100% it's a meme. So good luck with that one. Yeah.
Please do give me the title.
Yeah, Hawks at the Diner. It's short. It's only about 40 pages right there, but it's a hell of a book. I highly recommend everybody buy and 5-star it, or just don't fuck with the reviews. Anyhow, Anime King right here says before I ask this question, let me ask you: do you identify as a Muslim?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So then I will ask this question. Anime King asks: is Islam compatible with Marxist theory, and in what way? Considering most scholars denounce Marxism, and at its core, Marxism is inherently anti-religious. Lastly, what are your thoughts on Salafism and Muhammad Abdul Wahhab?
So the first question is Marxism compatible, or socialism, better to say, is it compatible with Islam? And yes, it is. The reason that lots of scholars state to the contrary is because they're dealing with a historical experience. And when we look at, like, for example, the way that the Soviet Union, for example, or Albania treated religion, we can see that, yeah, it's very negative. And as a result, that's what they assume that all socialism is. No, those were grave mistakes on the parts of those socialist administrations. And these are mistakes that shouldn't be repeated in the future. That being said, most Islamic scholars have very bad understandings of socialism and have very bare bones analysis of capitalism, as you may imagine. Their area of expertise isn't economics or political economy or sociology. It is mostly theological matters and the stuff around that. We can talk way more extensively about this in the DMs. So if you're interested, message me. As for the question of Marxism being inherently anti-religious. It is inherently secular, not anti-religious. Now, when people say anti-religious, is because there's materialism is a founding principle of Marxism. Well, that is true, but what we need to realize is that the materialist arguments that are put forth are basically philosophical dead ends that reach a point where they just kind of change lane into the usual atheist arguments you encounter. There's nothing inherently more potent, let's say, about the Marxist criticism of, or the supposed materialist criticism of religion that Marxists put forth that anybody else hasn't already put forth. That's the fundamental point. The second point is there are some errors that are made. For example, Engels makes the common error where he says that, once the material basis for religion disappears, religion will disappear. He's making a very, let's say, mechanically materialistic point here. This is just wrong. Some people are religious because of their conditions. For example, they're very poor and they have faced lots of hardship, and as a result, they turn to a higher power. But also, many people, like myself, are religious for other questions, like the quote-unquote big questions of life. The why are we here, and what is my purpose, and all of this couldn't have come from nothing, like these sort of questions. And if that is a perspective, then even if the material basis of poverty and whatnot were to be eradicated, then you'd still have people who have those inherent curiosities within themselves. So you can't say that religion will disappear. You could say maybe that religion will change. You could say that maybe the practices might change, or the way that we understand it might change. But you can't say that it will be gone completely and that everybody will be just like a secular, edgy Reddit atheist. But other than that, there's a lot more we can talk about. We can talk about the pitfalls of materialism, or the materialist analysis of belief. But this will go on for way longer, because then we're going to delve into philosophy. I'm going to have to start defining terms. So if you're interested in this, DM me. And by the way, I should have said this way earlier. If you want to DM me, please DM me on Twitter, not on Discord, because I really don't like how Discord works. But I'll answer everybody who's already wrote to me on Discord. But please do DM me on Twitter instead.
Okay, cool.
So,
that's good. Okay, so I also want to get Mango right here, who's a constant fixture in our AMAs right here. He says, Hakim, do you think the U.S. will ever become a Marxist-Leninist state? Pepe hands. When will a revolution happen?
I can't see into the future, so I can't tell you that. Do I think it will be Marxist-Leninist? I have no idea. I think that there's two things that will occur in this world. Either the United States will become socialist, or we all die, basically. I think that the United States will not go out without a fight. I don't think the United States is going to go the way of the Soviet Union. It's not going to be not with a bang, but with a whimper. I think the United States is going to fight tooth and nail to maintain its current position in the world order, and
confirm.
Yeah, and that includes their possession of nuclear weapons and a massive military. So yeah, it's not going to be quiet. So either a revolution does occur and socialism does happen, or we all have to face potentially nuclear war. With that being said, a time frame, that depends on you, the Americans. It's up to you guys when you want to overthrow the current system that you live in, which has basically all benefits given to the absolute minority of wealthiest, while your family members have to go without healthcare, without proper education, while people are incarcerated for basically trumped up charges, small drug possession, particularly if they're of particular racial orientation. Where there is a constant system of fighting against you, where you can never feel a sense of security in your country, even though that you're born here, that you live here, that you die here. I'm not even American, but I can imagine how it must be for you guys, where some of you have family members that have died for the country, and afterwards they throw them to the streets so they can't even get veterans benefits. They can't get anything. I mean, at this point, it is up to you guys to take your own country's future into your own hands and decide, hey, we want to run things differently for the for the mass of people, for the people who actually do the work, for the mom and dad and apple pie, all that kind of stuff. That's my very propagandistic speech to you guys.
Yeah, and that equally propagandistic. Fucking never. This is America. God damn it. But no, I have a book about that too. It's called The Right to Bear Arms. Yeah, it was just a fucking oodle of plugs here today. There, check them out. It's about a soldier who loses both of his arms.
Definitely take a look at all that.
Yeah. I just love to promote myself. So, Anime King says in the chat, he's sad that you didn't list your thoughts on Salafism and Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
By the way, it's a light H. It's Wahhab, not Wahhab. But yeah,
I want to get my ayin in there. Ayin. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But yeah,
have fun. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hey, تتكلم عربي؟
La.
We'll have a conversation later. Oh, it's good that I didn't bust out the Iraqi accent, because then you would have not understood anything. Anyway, so the questions about Salafism and okay, so what is colloquially known in the West as Salafism, but more, I guess, regionally we call it the Najdi propagation, or the Najdi Dawah, let's say. Can
you do me a favor and just give like a very broad explanation of exactly what it is? Most people are not gonna know off the top of their head.
Yeah. Salafism is basically a concept or an idea. It's a reformist movement within Islam. That's something that a lot of people do not know. It is not in any way rooted in traditional scholarship. It is basically those fascist memes that go reject modernity, embrace tradition, right? Mm-hmm. It's something like that, but a way more extreme version, where it's basically like reject all tradition and go back to the very first generation after the Prophet. basically.
shit.
What what we call the salaf. These people, it's the very first, and then the tabi'un, the people. It's the first 2 generations after the Prophet. These people and their opinions and whatnot should be taken to heart. But the thing is that they don't even take these people's opinions to heart. They twist them in a way to justify very strange ideologies. Now, this was generally developed by Muhammad Abdul Wahhab in the middle of the 1800s.
Can you give
in
us an
Saudi Arabia.
example of one of the strange twists on ideology? Because I can't hear that and not want to get at a specific example.
For sure, yes. Okay, for example, I'll give you a good one. In traditional Islamic practice throughout all of history, there is we do not worship graves, right? Certain Christian sects do, for example, and that's like a point of criticism that Islam has had of, for example, Christianity. In Islam, we don't have worship of graves, but certain populations do venerate certain graves. For example, let's say a prophet's grave. For example, the prophet Noah or the prophet Yunus, it's Jonah, or other prophets, where we know where they're buried. Some people venerate those graves. They like put flowers around it. Sometimes they go and they pray near those graves. In what Salafi ideology says is that these people, by doing so, have excommunicated themselves from Islam. They are no longer Muslim because they're doing something that we're not, quote unquote, not supposed to do. Despite the fact that they're not worshiping the graves, they're just venerating them. And hey, certain Muslims have those disagreements with that too. For example, I personally would not choose to take part in that practice, but I know people that do, and fine, to each their own. Why not? I know you're not worshiping the person in the grave. You're just doing it because it's a traditional cultural thing, and also other reasons. But these people, not only, they don't say live and let live, like, I don't agree with it, but whatever. What they think is like, you have excommunicated yourself. This is called takfir. That's why sometimes you maybe have seen the term takfiri when they're described, which means is like making them kuffar, making them disbelievers. So they're saying like, oh,
we have
you're
similar automatic excommunication things within Catholicism. There are some acts where when you commit them, you're assumed to be automatically excommunicated. So there's a parallel at least.
Thank you for the perspective. Yeah, exactly right. And so what these people will do then, they take a next step, which then can be like, oh, we have to forcibly correct these acts. And this quote unquote forcible correction can include everything from like points of humiliation and whatnot to even outright violence and murder. And every step of that process is Islamically, you cannot sanction it. It is illegal, both from an Islamic perspective as well as from a theological perspective. But this is what exists. Now, what is the issue with it? Well, when Saudi Arabia became a thing, when the Britain and the US set up the Saudi monarchy as their own little kind of like puppets in the region, these people adopted and began advocating this brand of Islam to the rest of the world, right? And this then went on to morph to other forms, it's already extreme and it went to become even more extreme. For example, the ideology of Daesh, of ISIS, is one of those ideologies. They follow a very extreme version of this. By the way, if I say this to a person who is of that persuasion, they would highly disagree. But the ideological continuum and let's say the genetic relation between these ideologies is highly documented, especially by scholars in the field, particularly even particularly Islamic scholars in the field. Yeah, if you want a good book about this, just generally, there's a book called Management of Savagery. I believe it's by Max.
What a title! That's amazing. Yeah. Max Blumenthal, Management of Savagery. I like it.
Yeah. And if you want a Islamic scholars' position on these ideologies, there is a really good book that's in its English translation. I believe it's in its second edition. It's called Refuting ISIS by Sheikh al-Yaqoubi. He's a Syrian scholar, and he is a descendant of the Prophet as well. So yeah, look him up. The name of the book is Refuting ISIS. You'll definitely find it. So yeah, these are 2 books to look into. But I hope that covers your question.
Absolutely. Honestly, like just listening in, that's a fantastic answer to that question. And I picked up a lot. This is one of my favorite things about doing these AMAs is getting perspectives like that I don't run into every day. So thank you. I enjoyed that one. Okay, I'm going to be skipping through a bunch of these to, how long do you have left? Do you have another 30 minutes? Do you have longer?
Yeah, I thought we'd do 2 hours. I think that's fair for the.
Yeah, so I'm going to try to get, I'm going to skip a few of these questions that are similar to ones that we've already touched on here. So Well, this guy's Matt CIA plant. Do not trust. Um, so this is an interesting question. Do you think there's an honest, ethical method to sanction rivals, or should global powers avoid it altogether since it's an instrument of economic exploitation? And so this is you absolutely would have firsthand knowledge of
Yeah.
how sanctions function.
This is a very good question. So thank you to the person that asked it. What I would say is that, just like a quick answer, no, I don't think sanctions should ever be a thing. If there's a way that you could make them work, then please, the entire world would like to know. So please come out with the answer. But I personally, in my personal experience as well as my research, it's just all negativity. Why? Because what it does is it doesn't punish leadership; it punishes the people. Yeah, so what you end up with is like increasing poverty and reduced access to medical equipment and food and whatnot to the vast majority of the population, while relatively not harming the leadership. There are different kinds of sanctions that you can place. For example, individual sanctioning. For example, you freeze the assets of a particular individual. Let's say, for example, hypothetically, Donald Trump or anybody else. You were to freeze their assets so that they wouldn't be able to use the property they own. They wouldn't be able to mobilize the wealth that they have sitting in banks and whatnot, on and on. Maybe that's a superior method. But the thing is that we need to remember that as it currently stands, economic sanctions exist as a arm of American foreign policy to bully countries into aligning with what the United States wants them to do, right? Privatizing, for example, industry, or not basically doing something that would be otherwise positive for their population, usually across the board. That's how it is. That's why they sanctioned, for example, Libya. That's why they sanctioned Venezuela and Cuba, which has been under embargo for 60 years now. So
It's
yeah,
honestly insane at this point.
it is the word for it. So that's what I would say. It's not a good option.
Okay, fantastic. So I want to get to Aetheris Hispade. No, I'm sorry, Aetheris Hispidia. And if I mispronounce your Discord name, you just made it up and added like an anime avatar anyway. So like, fuck off. Aetheris asks, would you consider wage laborers employed in the public sector to be proletariat, such as teachers, police officers, public defender lawyers, CIA analysts, soldiers, or the President of the United States? If not, why? And what do you consider them as?
Yes. This is a very nice question, actually. So I thank you for asking that. This is where we get very interesting. This is why I personally am so enamored with Marxism, because the analysis is never just superficial. It gets deeper and deeper, and the more you look into it, the more you find further layers to delve into. And this is what it is. Across the board, all those people you mentioned are proletarian. They are working class people, whether they be soldiers, whether they be even actors or whatever. They are people who sell their labor power in return for a wage. They fit the definition of a working class person, of a proletarian definition. Now, when it comes to, let's say, people who are very wealthy, let's say, but they still are in this position, what do we call those people? Well, here's where an analysis of a labor aristocracy comes in, right? If you look at the world generally, right? If you look at civil servants in, for example, the U.S., high-level civil servants, they're still working class, but they get paid very well. Other levels, for example, include what's it called, actors and those artistic types. They're also working class people, but they get paid very highly. You look at lawyers and doctors, for example. They are people who usually, if they work in a public system, for example, they are proletarian, but they still get paid very highly. So we need to look at, number one, an analysis of labor aristocracy, which means basically that there's increased basically bit of the pie that's given to these people, be they like high civil servants or high lawyers or stuff like that. Or number two, it's they are proletarian, but they have petty bourgeois aspirations, as we say, to use kind of like a truism. Petty bourgeois aspirations, as in they, even though they're proletarian, they don't want to be proletarian, and their current standing could maybe hopefully propel them into a higher class, right? Into being part of maybe starting like as a medical professional. Maybe you'll start your own clinic, a private clinic, and then you'll be a petty bourgeois owner of a private clinic. And then your aspirations, your class interests align closer to the ruling class than they do with the working class, right? When we reach, for example, you see the same with like lawyers and whatnot. So these are perspectives we need to take into account. If you want to look at also people who are working class, who still make like not that good money, but otherwise still align themselves with ruling class interests. You should take a look into the works of Gramsci. He wrote extensively about this. He is the one who developed the concept of hegemony. It's called, I'm sure you've heard it before, cultural hegemony, the idea that the prominent ideas or the popular ideas of society are the ideas of the ruling class, right? And society itself reproduces ruling class ideological motives. You can look at the work of Althusser. Oh my lord, the English title was oh my lord, the something of capitalism. Hold on, I need to check this from myself.
Sure. Yeah. I'll just sit here and have a banana of silence for my homie George.
On the
it's done for.
reproduction of capitalism is what it was. My apologies.
Please repeat.
On the reproduction of capitalism by Althusser.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry about that. The brain fart happened, and I wouldn't have been able to sleep if I could remember the title. But yes, so that's another work that you can take a look into how capitalism reproduces itself on a social level. So I hope I covered this question, actually, because I touched on three things.
I think more than adequate. And we'd like to get to kind of like our lightning round here. I'd like to get as many of the pinned questions as we possibly can. Thank you to everybody who's been so patient for this whole thing. So Greta says, how do you think, as a Marxist-Leninist, that your ideal world would solve resource and land scarcity? There are already wars over water in Ukraine, and there will possibly be in the future between Ethiopia and Egypt. That's going to happen. They're at some point, they're going to dam the Nile. Do you think Europe, China, or USA will stop exploiting third world nations to get those resources just because? What's the material incentive of the proles of these nations to stop taking from the third world, which greatly benefits them?
Sure. The question is very good. But I'll say, number one, the most working class people do not see the benefits of the wars that are fought by their ruling classes, right? The vast majority of the benefits that are seen go to, number one, the ruling class itself, number two, its political lackeys, and number three, those who directly supported the war effort within the industrial base of the country. So those who produced armaments, for example. So the Raytheons and the other such companies. For example, the Iraq War was a perfect example for this. The American population saw no improvement of their material standards. In fact, they saw an immiseration.
They saw, yeah, huge. It's like a huge boondoggle for us. Yeah, we're still paying the tab.
Do you know who didn't see a decrease in their living standards, though?
Yeah, my boy Dick Cheney, dangling Dick Cheney, is sitting pretty well right now. He just gets to shoot whoever he wants in the face. He's got an endless supply of artificial robot hearts. He's doing good.
Jesus Christ, if I've ever seen somebody who looks more like a devil. But yeah,
I met him and Rummy, both IRL.
Did you?
And they are absolutely fucking reptilian lizards from outer space. They are bloodthirsty cocksuckers, both of them. So you take it from your boy, Load Radio.
I don't know how you resisted the urge to tear their throats out with your bare hands, but
I would have been executed.
Yeah, I understand that. But yeah, so what I'm saying is that who saw the improvement of that, or it was the oil companies and the arms companies and the politicians who took part. That just goes across the board. So war is not.
Wait, just before I miss this, so Greta is taking issue with the explanation right there. Greta says it's completely wrong. Taking from a political enemy already benefits them. It benefits them by lowering prices. It destroys rising economy that might ally with enemies. Europeans benefited greatly from imperialism. So Greta, we're kind of talking about two different eras. The modern era of exploitation of third world nations generally benefits large corporations and state level things, whereas like the early areas of imperialism absolutely resulted, as you said, in a flood of goods and services and stolen things. But that's no longer the case. That's not how sort of imperialism works any longer.
To add on to that, also, the point about, for example, current imperialism, there is a small segment, like I mentioned, of society that does directly benefit from imperialism. That is the labor aristocracy that I mentioned. If you really want to look into this, then take a look at the works of Zach Cope, Zakcope. He'll have all the answers for you with extensive documentation. It's the numbers actually get kind of boring after a while, but they're very good works otherwise. So take a look into that. As for the general idea of how would socialism deal with this, well, here's the issue or the solution. Under socialism, number one, we want to have an economic plan. We don't want to have basically allocation according to markets, basically according to profit. We want allocation according to need. That's number one. Number two, if you look at the resources of the earth, generally across the board, we have enough fuel, we have enough water, we have enough food, and we also have enough capacity to produce those things to provide for the need of more than the current population that exists on the earth, more than the current, 7.5 billion or 8 billion that exists on the earth. Far more, actually. We have food or agricultural areas capable of producing at current levels of development. And by the way, not all arable land is utilized to the same levels of efficiency that can feed up to 11 billion people. There exists technology of massive desalination for water. This exists in Saudi Arabia, for example.
I'm sorry. Can I jump in there? The figure of being able to feed 11 billion people is only there's certain that figure I see it tossed around all the time, but it doesn't mean that you can sustainably feed those
Yeah,
11
I
billion
understand,
people,
yeah.
right? There are like cycles of basically like the nitrogen cycle isn't forever, right?
Exactly right,
We can do that for maybe a century, and then where everything is vastly depleted and we're in a terrible situation.
That's exactly right. No. Thank you for the clarification. What I mean by that is that with current levels of agricultural development, particular scientific agricultural development, if arable land was used sustainably, but also to its maximum efficiency, we could provide for that. When it comes to the 11 billion mark, it usually has certain set points that we need to talk about. For example, it talks about specifically meeting the caloric necessity of populations. It doesn't reach, for example, the points about consumption levels differing between nations. That's number one. Number two, that's not even touching on the massive amount of food waste that happens in most of the world, particularly in the developed world, where nearly half of all food gets wasted. And by the way, in some cases, food waste in the third world is even worse because they don't have the appropriate methods of preserving food that is getting to market. For example, a popular case that's given, for example, in Egypt and Iraq that you have is that sometimes they'll farm tomatoes and then they'll have them sitting in a truck basically in the hot sun, and half of them are ruined before they get to market, for example, because they don't have appropriate refrigeration. They're poor farmers. They're not gonna, and other such examples. That being said, though, generally across the board, with current levels of scientific development, and by the way, in the future we're only going to improve, we can meet the needs of basically everybody to a sufficient level. That doesn't mean that certain restrictions shouldn't apply. For example, the amount of energy expended per American is way too high. This is something that even Americans should recognize. If everybody on Earth consumed like an average American would, then we would need something like 50 Earths to meet the demand, compared to an average, for example, Nigerian or average Iraqi, for example. That being said, what happens when you have proper economic planning for said things is that you can do allocation according to need. That doesn't mean that everybody will get their absolute fill, maybe. Sometimes it does happen. Traditionally, historically, that is what happened. But if it's on a worldwide scale, but it means that everybody will get what they need, like enough. But maybe they won't get to an extreme amount that they would like to be able to consume. That's number one. Number two, if there is extensive cooperation between nations, right? For example, the issue of the dam that's coming between Ethiopia and Egypt. This is an issue that if they were to put more cooperation towards, it could be fixed. It doesn't have to go to war. The reason it has to go to war is because, again, ruling class interests prevail. The two working classes of the independent nations would very much benefit from a more level-headed approach. Maybe, for example, let's say bonds that would be paid across for delaying the damming, so that appropriate collaterals for water supply can be found or developed. For example, in Egypt, this is something that could be done. Otherwise, there's several articles that have been written on this. So I'm not gonna talk about it too much, but this is something that could be done, in which both working classes of the two countries would benefit. But that's not what we're talking about. What's going on right now is that the two ruling classes of these countries are fighting over this, because one of them is poised to gain a lot of wealth and influence, and the other ruling class is supposed to lose a lot of wealth and influence, and that's why they want to push for this really heightened rhetoric and war and whatnot. So based on mutual cooperation, economic planning, scientific development, we can reach a kind of equalization point where everybody can see the maximum level of maximizing of standard of living, while taking into account the local limitations on the environment, on people's labor, on the society around you, so on and so on.
Let's get to Mao's question. And stop me if I ask this one. It's been a long AMA. Did I already ask? Email asked, do you think revolutionary leftists should participate in elections and vote for the lesser evil, or do you think bourgeois democracy is totally unnecessary?
Yeah, neither the two suggestions. It depends on the local conditions. If your current, this is something they should do with an organization where you have a proper discussion and reach upon democratic consensus what to do. Sometimes it is good to participate in electoralism. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it isn't even possible. And the general point is that you should have organizations that kind of have their foot in everything. You should have a foot in being able to push some sort of electoral demand. You should have a foot in organizing, community arranging. You should have a foot in trade union movements and like a side note, maybe even illegal methods if it's possible. Yeah. I think you understand what I mean. I've talked about this before in several videos. I talked about it also in my most recent video, the problems of the Western left. So take a look at that.
Okay. I'm going to get to a question. I looked for you in the chat, Poganist, but if I don't see you in the chat, like on a cursory thing, I can't promote you to the top of the stage there. So Poganist.com says, how do you respond to allegations made by reformists like Socialism Done Left and others that we ought to be skeptical of revolutionary leftist ideologies given their failure to institute socialism in first world capitalist countries? Often, reformists will state that revolutions can only be successful in third world countries, largely in virtue of workers there having less to lose in the event of failure. Under what circumstances would a Leninist or vanguard revolution be successful in neoliberal capitalism? I am familiar with Marx's predictions, but I want your view specifically. It's a great question.
Thank you for that. My personal perspective is mentioned again in that video that I mentioned, the failure of social democracy. Yeah, I forget the first half of the title, but you look it up. If you write the failure of social democracy, it'll come up. But yeah, that I express my view in detail there. Also, a good book that I'd recommend is Emmanuel Argueri's book, Unequal Exchange and the Prospects of Socialism, which you can find as a free PDF online. So read that as well. Having said that, though, I would say that generally no revolution has occurred, or I mean, very rarely has a revolution occurred in a first world developed nation. I think the only example that a person can mention is East Germany, the GDR, and that was as a result of war and whatnot. It's not a realistic approach to follow. With that said, though, the current existence of social relations within the United States and other developed Western countries disallows certain radical activity. Currently, revolution is not the most likely. I'm not saying it's impossible. Nothing is impossible. I'm saying it's not as likely in the United States. It's not as likely in Germany or in the UK. That doesn't mean that isn't the case in the future. As Marxists, we have to be realists and we have to see what is the thing that will bring about revolution and bring about the abolition of capitalism and the institution of socialism. And when we think about it in that sphere, we need to realize that historically, as well as even to this day, the most likely form or place for revolution to occur is in the imperial periphery. It's more likely going to occur in Bangladesh or Peru or the Philippines or India. It's not going to occur in Sweden or the UK or the US. And if that's the case, then we should support those movements, because what do? They break links in the chains of capitalism, in the chains of imperialism. They weaken the power of imperialist countries that rely on those third world countries, those imperial periphery countries, for their wealth and their ability to kind of placate their populations, which will then cause them to turn inwards and force basically further exploitation of their populations. Again, like how it used to be 100 years ago in the US, like in the 1910s and 1920s in the US. And as a result of that, there will be a heightening of the class struggle within the US or the UK or Germany, where have you, and then it becomes a possibility. It isn't a reformist take, it's more a assessment based on the current material conditions. In 1912, revolution may have been possible in the US. Currently, I think it's far less likely than it was historically. But hey, I'm leaving this up to American comrades to discuss further, and also to prove me wrong. Please do have your revolution.
No, it's hopeless. I do. Every time I hear Links on the Chain, I just want to shout out to Phil Oakes. His song Links on the Chain is one of my favorite protest songs of all time. Check him out if you can. Okay, so we're towards the end of this AMA, and I wanted to end with Ducky Concho's final question right here. So he asked several, but I want to ask this one. He asked, what are your thoughts on Saddam, the current Iraqi government, and other former Iraqi governments? And if you would care to where do you see Iraq going in the next 20 years or so?
Yeah, I get this question asked every single AMA I
do. Do you want to skip it for another one? Because like, yeah, if it's, I've got another one in the chamber. Yeah, let's skip it for another one. I'm sorry, I tried. So And blah, blah, blah's question was, what was your opinion on implementing socialism in post-industrial countries where there isn't a dire need for change? That's the exact question we just answered right there. Um, so how about this one from Pres Material? Hakim, seeing as you're a medical worker and from a more impoverished country, I'm sorry for the diss, what do you think global vaccination policy should be? Should vaccine manufacturing nations give out some basic level of vaccinations to help extend the tide all over, or should they secure their own nations first before sending out vaccinations?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. By the way, to the person who asked the question about Iraq, feel free to DM me on Twitter, and then we can talk about it as much as you like. But for now, we're tight on time. As for this question, though, I personally think that the approach that Cuba and China has had is far better, in which that they are increasing their capacity for production of vaccines, and also they're donating or giving very cheaply vaccines and necessary supplies to third world countries. I think the appropriate oh Lord, what's the English word? Course. Right now should be, first of all, to have no copyright or any form of IP over any life-saving anything, medicine or vaccines or what have you, should not be copyrighted and prevented from being like reproduced elsewhere. That's number one. Number two, the countries that do have the industrial base to produce vaccines should help countries that don't to develop their own industrial base in this sphere. Yeah, of course, because less people being infected in India and in Iraq and in Egypt and in wherever else, in Brazil, means less infections down the line in the US and Sweden. Everybody really benefits, right? It's very myopic and very short-sighted to be like, let's just secure our own population first. Of course, you should. You should maximize the vaccination program for your country. But also, that doesn't mean that you should privatize or limit access to the information or the vaccine directly. And of course, as much internationalist like aid that can be given should be given in the form that China has done, in the form that Cuba has done. That's my personal perspective on it.
Okay. So the immediate counterpoint that somebody would ask is, if you eliminate the profit motive from the development of drugs, are you worried that it will reduce the pace of development, since a lot of that is driven directly by the profit motive?
The vast majority, I'd like to introduce people or direct.
No, you're breaking up. So I'm gonna like just kind of talk to fill the silence right here, but can you try again?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yes.
Perfect. Yeah. What I was going to say is I would like to direct people to a great work titled The Entrepreneurial State, in which it is discussed that the vast majority of pretty much all development happens in the state sector, meaning state funded and state developed rather than the private sector. What happens in the private sector is the selling and basically price hiking that happens afterwards. It's the marketing and whatnot. That's where it comes into play. Now, when it comes to really big pharmaceutical companies, if they were nationalized and then run on a state-run basis or even cooperative basis, they would be as effective, if not more effective. When you look at the terms of these things, you're going to see that the vast majority of life-saving medicines, okay, right now COVID is kind of a big deal, so they want to develop vaccines for it. Fair enough. But the vast majority of medicine that could be life-saving for very bad diseases is not even really researched all that well, because it's not as profitable as, for example, foot fungus cream or acne cream, which has a much wider base to reach, even though foot fungus or acne is not going to kill you. But drugs against leukemia, or drugs against certain kinds of other cancers, or drugs against very rare congenital disorders, which can save lives, are barely looked at or even researched, because there is no money in it. And even if they are researched and produced, the hope is that they can be sold to the state at exorbitant amounts. Like I'm talking like millions of dollars per dose usage. So they're still hoping that there's going to be down the line some money to be made. It's better for such things, I think, to be in the hands of systems that are more oriented towards the mass of the working people and people who benefit from it rather than from profit. So yeah. And also, yeah, the book, the entrepreneurial state. Excuse me. You should check that book out.
Let me see. So we're at 5:57 here. Do you have any closing remarks or things that you want to promote, or comrades that you want to clue people into that you haven't had a chance to talk about?
Sure thing. All right. So I have. For right now, I have nothing too special. In the next couple of days, I'm going to upload a talk I had with Richard Wolff, so you can check that out on my channel. Otherwise, if you have any questions for me, please feel free to DM me on Twitter, and I'll get to you eventually. Give me a couple of days, please, because I'm sure I'm going to have a large volume. I get like 30 DMs a day as it is. So that being said, as for some comrades to shout out. I would like to shout out a couple. One of which is Yugopnik. He makes absolutely excellent videos regarding. By the way, the way it's spelled is YUGOPNIK. He makes absolutely excellent videos about just practically everything, but usually ideology under capitalism. Very good. I'd recommend his video on the commodification of the bread tuber aesthetic. Very great video. Other than that, I would recommend also Bay Area 415. He makes a lot of good videos on China and the current issues. He made recently an absolutely amazing video about the Xinjiang issue.
Ooh.
Yeah, so I highly recommend you check that.
Check that out. Yeah.
It's an hour and a half or so. Bay Area 415. He's really good. Another person I would like to shout out is Paul Morin. He does really long form interview style videos. I've been on his show, if you want to call it that, 2 times. I highly recommend you check that out. My God, there's so many other people. If you DM me, and I'll tell you about all the cool people that there are to check out.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I gotta say, like, I came into this very suspicious and had a hard time parsing like your a tremendous profusion of words. But you have won me over. Thank you for participating in this AMA. Yeah, well done.
Thank you very much. I apologize to everybody for my rapid rate of speech. Sometimes when I
Don't
want
worry
to
about it.
get an idea, it takes a while. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk here.
Yeah.
And I would gladly do this again. So just ask for me and I'll show up.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody who asked questions and participated in this AMA chat. If we couldn't get to your question, Hakim has very generously offered to like answer your DMs and so forth. And some just honestly, these are some of the best questions that I have seen in any one of our AMAs right there. And